Once he was a hero, a highly trained canine police officer, feared by criminals and trusted by his handler. He had saved lives, taken down dangerous suspects, and stood fearless in the face of danger. But when his time in service ended, he was discarded like an old piece of equipment. No retirement ceremony, no second chance, just thrown into a dark, filthy cage in an unauthorized kennel, left to rot. For months, he lived in isolation, his powerful body growing weak, his once sharp mind clouded with confusion and sorrow. He had given everything to serve and protect. But in the end, no one came for him. No one even remembered his name. Until one day, someone did. A man stepped into the abandoned kennel, moving cautiously between the rusted cages. The moment their eyes met through the bars, time stopped. Recognition flickered in the dog's tired golden eyes. Could it really be? What happened next will leave you speechless. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel, like this video, and turn on notifications. Your support helps us bring you more inspiring stories like this one. Now, let's dive into the incredible journey of a forgotten canine and the man who reasoned to forget him. The air inside the abandoned kennel was thick with the stench of neglect, damp, rotting wood, rusted metal, and something far worse. The cages, lined up in uneven rows, were coated in grime, the floor littered with old straw and scraps of uneaten food. The dogs inside were no better, some too weak to lift their heads, others pacing restlessly, their ribs pressing against their thin coats. But in the farthest corner, where the light barely reached, lay a dog unlike the others. He didn't whimper, he didn't bark, he didn't pace like the others. He simply lay still, his large frame curled in on itself, his once mighty muscles reduced to shadows beneath his fur. His ears, which had once stood proud and alert, barely twitched at the sound of footsteps. His eyes, once sharp enough to track a suspect from 100 yards away, barely lifted as the man approached. No one had spoken his name in months. The German Shepherd had once been called Shadow. He had served with the police force for years, working side by side with his handler, Officer Daniel Carter. Together, they had taken down criminals, uncovered illegal operations, and protected countless lives. Shadow had been more than just a police dog. He had been Daniel's partner, his protector, his best friend. But when Shadow grew older, the department made a decision, one Daniel had fought against with everything he had. Shadow was to be retired. Daniel had begged to adopt him, to take him home where he belonged, but the department's policies were strict. Retired canines were either sent to select shelters for adoption or, if no home could be found, euthanized. Daniel had signed every form, made every phone call, but then, one day, Shadow was simply gone. They told him the dog had been placed, but no one could say where. It was as if his best friend had vanished overnight. Daniel never stopped searching. It had been nearly a year since Shadow disappeared when Daniel received an anonymous tip about a hidden, illegal kennel operating in an abandoned warehouse outside the city. He had heard rumors before, places where unwanted or discarded dogs were kept in terrible conditions, used for fights, or worse. But when he saw the grainy photo attached to the tip, one that showed a thin, familiar-looking German Shepherd curled up in a rusted cage, his breath caught in his throat. Shadow. Daniel didn't hesitate. He didn't go through the proper channels, didn't wait for backup. He drove through the night, headlights cutting through the darkness, heart pounding harder with every mile. The thought of his partner, his best friend, alone in a place like that, suffering, abandoned, was too much to bear. The moment he stepped inside, rage and heartbreak crashed over him at once. The kennel was worse than he had imagined. The conditions were horrific. He had spent years raiding places like this, rescuing animals from the hands of those who saw them as nothing more than profit. But this time, it was personal. His flashlight beam cut through the darkness, sweeping over cages, over pairs of hollow eyes staring back at him. Some of the dogs cowered, some growled, but one didn't move at all. Daniel's heart clenched as he stepped closer. The cage in the corner, the large, unmoving form inside. He crouched down, pressing a hand against the rusted bars, and whispered the name he hadn't spoken in a year. Shadow. The German Shepherd didn't react at first. His breathing was shallow, his coat dull. But then, his ears twitched. His body tensed slightly, as if the name had pulled him back from a place too deep to reach. Slowly, painfully, he lifted his head. And then, their eyes met. For the first time in months, Shadow's dull, tired gaze flickered with something else. Something almost like recognition. His body trembled, his nose twitched as he inhaled the familiar scent of the man in front of him. Daniel swallowed hard, his vision blurring. "It's me, boy. I found you." Shadow blinked. Then, as if afraid to believe it, he let out the smallest, broken whimper. A sound Daniel had never heard from him before. A sound of longing, of hope. But before he could react, before he could break open the cage and pull his partner into his arms, a sharp noise echoed through the dark. Footsteps. Someone else was in the building. Daniel stiffened, his instincts kicking in. Shadow tensed, his ears perking up despite his weakened state. They weren't alone. And if Shadow had been locked up here all this time, that meant someone had been keeping him here. Daniel clenched his jaw, reaching for the weapon holstered at his side. This rescue wasn't going to be easy, but nothing was going to stop him from taking Shadow home. Not this time. Daniel's pulse pounded in his ears as he instinctively reached for his firearm. The air inside the kennel felt heavier now, laced with something more than just the scent of neglect. Danger. Whoever had been running this place hadn't expected company, and if they were still here, they wouldn't let him walk out with Shadow without a fight. Shadow's body had stiffened at the sound of the approaching footsteps. Even in his weakened state, his instincts were still there. His ears twitched, his breathing hitched, and though he was frail, Daniel could see the faint flicker of the trained canine he once was. But his reaction was slower than it should have been. He was too weak. If they were going to get out of here, Daniel would have to act fast. A metal door groaned open somewhere in the shadows. The footsteps grew louder. Daniel lowered his body, steadying himself behind Shadow's cage, his free hand gripping the rusted bars. The voice that followed made his skin crawl. "Didn't think we'd be getting visitors tonight," a gruff voice muttered. Daniel didn't answer. His mind raced, calculating every option. He couldn't see the man yet, but the voice was moving closer, deliberate, heavy boot steps crushing dirt and debris with each step. If the guy was armed, this could turn into a deadly situation fast. Shadow let out a low, warning growl, not as strong as it once would have been, but enough to remind Daniel that the dog still had fight left in him. "Easy, boy," Daniel whispered, just loud enough for Shadow to hear. A flashlight beam swept through the room, cutting across the cages. Dogs whimpered, some retreating into the darkness, while others barked weakly. The light hit Daniel's position, and for a split second, he saw the silhouette of the man holding it. Stocky, rough-looking, probably in his late 40s. Not law enforcement, not someone who should be here. The man's eyes narrowed. "Who the hell are you?" Daniel rose slowly, keeping his voice steady. "These dogs don't belong here, especially not that one." He jerked his head toward Shadow, his body positioning making it clear he wasn't leaving without him. The man scoffed. "Oh, this one? He's a tough bastard. I was planning on selling him, but..." He studied Shadow, as if realizing for the first time how sickly the dog looked. "Not much left of him now, is there?" Daniel's fingers clenched into a fist. "Open the cage." The man let out a low chuckle, shaking his head. "You're not a cop." Daniel pulled out his badge, holding it up just long enough for the man to see. "Actually, I am." That changed things. The man's posture shifted, his grip on the flashlight tightening. Then you know you're trespassing. And you know this whole operation is illegal. Daniel took a slow step forward. I can call for backup right now, or you can make the smart choice and let me take my dog and walk out of here. The man's eyes darted toward the entrance, calculating his own escape. Daniel didn't want to risk him running. If he had other men working here, things could spiral fast. Shadow let out another low growl, sensing the tension. It was a sound Daniel had heard before, a sound that meant his partner was ready to act. Listen, Daniel said, his voice steel. This dog was a police officer, a damn good one. He saved lives, and you locked him up in this hellhole. I don't care what you plan to do with him, but it ends now. The man hesitated, but then something in Daniel's eyes must have told him he wasn't bluffing. With a sharp exhale, he tossed a ring of keys across the floor. Take him and get out. Daniel didn't waste time. He snatched the keys, fumbling through them with shaking hands until he found the one that fit Shadow's cage. As soon as the lock clicked open, Shadow didn't hesitate. He pushed against the door, staggering as he tried to stand. Daniel crouched, gripping the dog's face gently, looking him in the eye. We're going home, buddy. Shadow let out a weak but unmistakable whine, his body shaking from exhaustion and emotion. Daniel turned to the man. This place is getting shut down. You can count on that. Then, supporting Shadow as best he could, Daniel moved toward the exit. But just as they reached the door, the man behind him muttered a curse under his breath. Then came the unmistakable sound of a gun being cocked. Daniel spun, shielding Shadow with his body as his own instincts kicked in. This wasn't over yet. The click of the gun sent a cold wave through Daniel's spine. His body reacted before his mind could fully process the threat. He turned sharply, placing himself between Shadow and the armed man. The dim light in the kennel glinted off the muzzle of a worn-out pistol, shaking slightly in the man's hand. I said, take the damn dog and go. The man spat, his voice tight, edged with uncertainty. His grip on the gun was firm, but Daniel had seen this before. The hesitation, the conflict. The man wasn't a killer, at least not yet. Shadow let out a faint growl beside him, his frail body trembling, but his instincts still intact. Even in his weakened state, he was ready to protect his handler. Daniel raised both hands slightly, his badge still visible in one of them. You don't want to do this, he said calmly, his voice even, controlled. His heart pounded, but his training took over. You pull that trigger, and your life is over. I guarantee you, law enforcement will hunt you down. Every officer in this city will make sure you don't walk free after this. The man's eyes flickered with something. Fear? Anger? Desperation? I got nothing left, he muttered. This kennel was my last chance. You shut it down. I got nowhere to go. Daniel took a slow step forward. Then don't make this worse. Don't add attempted murder of an officer to your record. You can still walk away from this. The man's breathing was ragged. His hand trembled, just slightly. The weight of the moment was crushing him. Daniel could see it, feel it. Then, Shadow made the decision for them. With the last of his strength, the German Shepherd pushed himself forward, not to attack, not to lunge, but to stand in front of Daniel, shielding him just as he had in their years on duty. His legs were unsteady, his frame gaunt, but his eyes held a familiar fire. A silent message. I protect you. The man's grip faltered. He stared at Shadow, at the bulk who had once been a warrior, now barely standing, yet still ready to give his life. His fingers twitched. Then, with a sharp, frustrated exhale, he lowered the gun. Daniel didn't move, didn't breathe, until the man tucked the weapon into his waistband and stepped back. The tension in the air crackled like a dying fire, slowly fading. Get out, the man muttered, voice hollow. Before I change my mind. Daniel wasted no time. Wrapping an arm around Shadow's weakened body, he guided him toward the exit, moving quickly, but carefully. Every step Shadow took was labored, but the moment his paws hit the outside pavement, something shifted. He hesitated, his nose twitching, ears perking up slightly. The cool night air, the distant sounds of the city. It was as if, for the first time in months, he realized he was free. Daniel crouched beside him, rubbing a hand along his ribs. You did good, buddy, he murmured. Let's get you home. But Shadow's legs buckled beneath him. His exhaustion had caught up. He had pushed himself beyond his limit. Daniel caught him just in time, scooping the weakened dog into his arms. Hang in there, Shadow, he said, voice tight. We're almost there. He carried his old partner to the truck, gently laying him across the passenger seat. Shadow let out a soft sigh, resting his head against Daniel's arm, his eyes half-lidded but watching. The bond between them, tested by time and distance, was still there, still unbreakable. Daniel turned the key, the engine roaring to life. As he pulled onto the road, he reached over, resting his palm on Shadow's side. The dog let out a low, contented breath, his body relaxing, as if for the first time in a long time. He finally felt safe. But Daniel knew this wasn't over yet. Shadow was free, but the damage had been done. He was weak, malnourished, and God only knew what kind of trauma he had suffered in that place. And there was one more thing Daniel couldn't shake. The man who had been running the kennel, the way he had looked at Shadow, the hesitation in his eyes, the fact that despite everything, he had let them go. Daniel had spent years reading people, understanding them in ways that weren't always obvious, and something told him that wasn't the last time he would see that man. As the city lights flickered past the windshield, Daniel focused on the only thing that mattered right now, the dog beside him. I got you, he whispered. I promise. Shadow let out a soft whine, a sound of trust. For the first time in a long time, they were together again. But their fight wasn't over. Not yet. Proximo. Come 700 palavras. O chat GPT DC. The drive to the nearest veterinary hospital felt like the longest of Daniel's life. Shadow lay curled up in the passenger seat, his breathing steady but weak. Every few minutes, Daniel reached over to place a reassuring hand on the dog's ribs, feeling the slow rise and fall of his chest. He was alive. That was what mattered. But the weight of what Shadow had been through pressed against Daniel's heart like a vice. The bright lights of the 24-hour animal hospital finally appeared ahead, casting a glow against the empty streets. Daniel pulled into the parking lot, his hands tightening around the steering wheel. He had seen Shadow injured before. During their years on the force, the dog had taken hits protecting him, fought through pain to complete a mission. But this was different. This time, there had been no mission, no purpose, just suffering. He jumped out of the truck and rushed around to the passenger side. Shadow tried to lift his head as Daniel opened the door, but his body was too weak to follow through. Hang in there, partner, Daniel murmured, carefully scooping the dog into his arms. Shadow let out a soft grunt of protest, but didn't resist. The moment Daniel stepped through the clinic doors, a woman behind the counter looked up, her face immediately shifting to concern. Help, Daniel called out. He needs medical attention now. Two vet techs rushed forward with a stretcher, and Daniel hesitated only for a second before laying Shadow down. The dog's ears twitched slightly at the movement, but he didn't resist. That worried Daniel more than anything. The Shadow he knew would have fought tooth and nail against being restrained, no matter the situation. What happened to him? One of the techs asked as they wheeled him toward the exam room. Daniel swallowed hard. He was locked up, starved. I don't know for how long. The woman nodded, her lips pressing into a thin line. We'll take care of him. Daniel followed them as far as he could until a second tech gently stopped him. "We need to run some tests. Let the vet work. You can wait out here." Every instinct screamed at Daniel to fight back, to stay by Shadow's side. But he knew better. He was used to being in control, taking action when things went wrong. But now, all he could do was sit in the waiting room and hope that he hadn't found Shadow too late. Minutes dragged into an hour. Daniel paced the floor, his mind running through everything that had happened. The abandoned kennel, the man who had been holding Shadow, the way he had hesitated before lowering the gun. Daniel knew he should be calling this in, alerting the department about the illegal operation. But right now, the only thing that mattered was Shadow. The rest could wait. Finally, the vet emerged from the back. She was a middle-aged woman with tired eyes but a kind expression. Daniel didn't give her time to speak before he stepped forward. "How is he?" "He's stable for now," she said carefully. "Severely malnourished, dehydrated. His muscle loss is significant. But," she hesitated. "But what?" The vet sighed. "His blood work showed signs of long-term neglect. He has infections in his ears and paws from the poor conditions. But more concerning," she glanced down at her clipboard before meeting Daniel's eyes, "there are signs of old injuries. Some healed. Others, not completely. Some of them aren't from accidents?" Daniel's jaw tightened. "You're saying he was abused?" The vet didn't answer immediately, but she didn't have to. "We've given him fluids, started him on antibiotics, and we'll monitor him closely. He's been through a lot. He needs rest, nutrition, and more than anything, stability." She glanced at him as if measuring his reaction. "I assume you're his owner?" Daniel straightened. "I was his handler. We worked together for years. I tried to adopt him when he retired, but they sent him somewhere else. I never knew where until now." The vet's expression softened. "Then it's a miracle you found him." Daniel ran a hand over his face, exhaling. "Can I see him?" She nodded. "He's sedated, but he'll be more comfortable if he knows you're there." Daniel followed her into the back, his heart hammering as they entered a quiet recovery room. Shadow lay curled up on a soft bed, hooked up to an IV, his breathing slow and steady. The moment Daniel stepped closer, Shadow's nose twitched. His ears barely flickered, but Daniel could tell, somewhere deep inside, he still recognized him. Daniel knelt beside him, resting a hand on his back. "Hey, buddy," he murmured. Shadow let out a low, sleepy sigh, shifting just slightly toward Daniel's touch. Daniel swallowed hard, his throat tightening. "You're safe now, I promise." The vet watched them for a moment before speaking again. "He's lucky to have you." Daniel shook his head, his eyes locked on Shadow. "No," he whispered. "I'm the lucky one." As Shadow's slow breathing filled the room, Daniel felt something shift deep inside him. He had gotten his partner back, but now he had to make sure Shadow never suffered again. And that meant going after the people who had done this to him. Daniel sat beside Shadow's recovery bed, his fingers gently running through the dog's coarse fur. The quiet beeping of medical monitors filled the room, but all Daniel could focus on was the slow, steady rise and fall of Shadow's chest. His partner was alive. That was the most important thing. But survival wasn't enough. Shadow had always been strong, a warrior. Seeing him like this, frail, vulnerable, made Daniel's stomach twist with anger. Someone had done this to him. Someone had taken a loyal police dog and tossed him aside like trash, locking him in that filthy cage, starving him, breaking him. And Daniel wasn't about to let that go. The vet had said Shadow needed rest, but Daniel couldn't sit still. He stood up, running a hand through his short-cropped hair, his mind already spinning through the next steps. He needed to call the department, report the kennel, get a team down there to shut it down for good. But more than that, he needed to know how Shadow had ended up there in the first place, because this wasn't just neglect. This was something deeper. He pulled out his phone and scrolled through his contacts until he found the number he needed. Detective Mike Herrera, one of the few people in the department Daniel still trusted completely. He pressed call and stepped into the hallway as the phone rang. It picked up on the third ring. "Carter?" Herrera's voice was groggy, thick with sleep. "Do you know what time it is?" Daniel didn't care. "I found Shadow." There was a long pause. Then Herrera's voice sharpened. "What?" "I found him. He was locked up in an illegal kennel outside the city. He's in bad shape, Mike. Real bad." Jesus. A rustling sound came through the phone as if Herrera was sitting up. "How the hell did he end up there?" "That's what I need you to help me figure out," Daniel said, pacing the hallway. "You remember when they retired him? They told me he was being placed in a shelter for adoption, but no one could give me any real answers. Then he just disappeared." "Yeah," Herrera muttered. "I remember it didn't sit right with you." "Because it wasn't right," Daniel snapped. "Something happened, and now I want to know who was behind it." Herrera exhaled heavily. "All right, I'll see what I can dig up in the records. But Carter, if someone deliberately sent him to that place, we might be dealing with something bigger than just a bad kennel." "I know," Daniel said darkly. "That's why I need the truth. I'll call you back as soon as I find something," Herrera promised. Daniel hung up and leaned against the wall, his jaw clenched. His gut told him this wasn't just a mistake. Someone had made sure Shadow disappeared. A soft sound behind him made him turn. Shadow had shifted slightly on the bed, his eyes barely open, watching him. Daniel stepped back inside, kneeling beside him again. "I'm going to make this right," he murmured. "I swear." Shadow let out a low, tired sigh, his tail thumping weakly against the blanket. Even after everything, he still trusted Daniel, and Daniel wasn't going to let him down. The hours dragged on, but Daniel didn't leave Shadow's side. The vet had said he needed rest, but every time Daniel even considered stepping away, Shadow's ears would flicker. His eyes would open just slightly, searching for him. So he stayed. He wasn't going anywhere. His phone buzzed in his pocket, and he grabbed it quickly. "Herrera!" Finally. Daniel stepped into the hallway before answering. "Tell me you found something." Herrera let out a long breath. "Yeah, and you're not gonna like it." Daniel's grip on the phone tightened. "Go on." "There's no official record of where Shadow was sent after retirement. Nothing in the system. It's like he just vanished." Daniel's stomach twisted. That doesn't just happen. Someone had to sign off on it. Exactly. I started digging into who handled K-9 retirements around that time. A name popped up, Sergeant Tom Wilkes. You remember him? Daniel clenched his jaw. "Yeah, I remember. He was in charge of rehoming retired K-9s, but I never trusted the guy." "Well, your instincts were right. Turns out, he had a side business. He was funneling retired K-9s and other unwanted working dogs into underground operations. Some were sold off to private buyers. Others..." Herrera hesitated. "Others ended up in places like the kennel you found." Daniel felt his blood turn to ice. "You're telling me that Wilkes was selling off K-9s instead of getting them adopted?" "Looks that way," Herrera said grimly. "And Shadow wasn't the only one." Daniel gritted his teeth, his hand curling into a fist. Shadow had given his life to protect people, to protect Wilkes's own damn officers, and this is how he was repaid? Tossed into a cage, forgotten, left to die? "Where's Wilkes now?" Daniel demanded. "That's the problem," Herrera said. "He disappeared 6 months ago. Retired early, cashed out his pension, and went off the grid. No one's seen him since." Daniel exhaled sharply, running a hand over his face. This was bigger than he'd thought. If Wilkes had been running an operation like this, there were more dogs out there suffering. More handlers who had no idea what had happened to their partners. And Wilkes had vanished. Daniel looked back through the window at Shadow, curled up on the hospital bed, his breathing slow but steady. He had barely survived. How many others hadn't been so lucky? "I need to find him," Daniel said, his voice low. Herrera sighed. "I figured you'd say that. I'll keep looking, see if I can track down any old contacts of his. But Carter, be careful. If he's still in this game, he won't go down easy." Daniel's lips pressed into a thin line. "Neither will I." He ended the call and stepped back into the room. Shadow's eyes flickered open, just barely, and Daniel knelt beside him. He ran a hand gently along the dog's fur, feeling the rise and fall of his breath beneath his palm. "We're gonna fix this," Daniel murmured. "We're gonna find the others, and we're gonna make them pay." Shadow didn't move much, but his tail gave a weak, slow wag. Daniel's chest tightened. Even now, after everything, Shadow still believed in him. He wouldn't let him down. Not this time. Daniel didn't waste time. The moment Shadow was stable enough to leave the clinic, he took him home. The dog was still weak, but there was something in his eyes now. A flicker of the old strength, the unbreakable bond that had carried them through so many missions before. Daniel had set up a soft bed in the living room, but Shadow refused to stay in it for long. Every time Daniel moved, Shadow tried to follow, his steps slow, his body still recovering, but his will unshaken. It was like he knew. This wasn't over yet. Herrera called again. "Got a lead. Wilkes was spotted a few states over. He's still moving dogs, Carter. Shadow wasn't the last." That was all Daniel needed to hear. He looked down at his old partner, the dog who had been left for dead, but had refused to give up. "You up for one more mission, buddy?" Shadow's ears twitched. His tail gave a weak wag. Daniel took that as a yes. They hit the road before dawn, tracking Wilkes's trail. Every mile that passed, Shadow seemed to regain a little more of himself. The police dog who had once taken down criminals with precision and strength was still in there, waiting for his moment. And when they finally found Wilkes, when Daniel confronted him in a dusty old lot where more dogs were being held in cages, Shadow was the one who stepped forward first. Wilkes barely had time to react before Shadow's deep, guttural growl cut through the air. The man's eyes went wide. He recognized the dog instantly. "You should have finished the job," Daniel said coldly. Shadow lunged. Not to kill, but to make sure Wilkes would never forget the name of the dog he had tried to break. By the time the authorities arrived, Wilkes was on his knees, shaking, surrounded by the very animals he had tried to profit from. Justice was finally served. As Daniel led Shadow back to the car, he knelt beside him, running a hand along his fur. "We did it," he murmured. Shadow leaned into him, letting out a deep, contented sigh. For the first time in a long time, they were both finally home.